Dan was the first child born to Jacob, not by his wife Leah. But Dan's mother wasn't Jacob's other wife Rachel either. As Leah pulled ahead by 4 sons in the race between the sisters who were both married to the same husband, Rachel planned to catch up by giving her servant Bilhah to their husband to produce offspring Rachel would then claim as her own. Bilhah gave birth to Dan, but Rachel considered him her own, naming him Dan because, as she said, "God has vindicated me, he has listened to my plea and given me a son." Dan means something like, "he judged." We know nothing about Dan. He doesn't take a leading role in any of the action of the rest of the book of Genesis. After the Exodus, the tribe that took its name from him, their ancestor, never really amounted to anything. Dan himself is hardly ever named apart from his full brother Naphtali, except for in the blessings the sons received from their father Jacob in Egypt shortly before Jacob's death. Dan gets a medium-length blessing in which Jacob says, Dan will provide justice for his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan will be a snake by the roadside, a viper along the path that bites the horse's heel so that its rider tumbles backward. I don't know what that means, or how that may have played out for Dan or the tribe made up of his descendants. If Dan is a source of justice for Israel, why didn't he or his tribe do anything? If Dan is a heel-biting snake, what does that say about the justice he provides? And who's the rider supposed to be? All I can think of is to go all the way back to Dan's beginning. Rachel judged God's decision to give a son to Jacob by her servant Bilhah. She assumed it meant that God had heard her plea, and she claimed the son as her own. So Dan grew up living with his dad and his biological mom and his dad's second wife, who called him her own son. Not to mention his dad's other wife and sister of the lady who called him her own son, and all the brothers and the one sister to whom he was variously related in ways that are more complicated than just brother and sister. Rachel sees Dan as a symbol of justice, of vindication. Would Dan have had any reason to see himself that way? And whatever he thought, what an uncertain source of justice he would be, wouldn't he? Kind of like a snake that strikes at a horse's heel, giving the right verdict, saying, "Don't come this way, it means death," but saying it to the wrong person. The horse didn't decide to go that way. The rider did. Maybe that's it. Maybe Dan is all about justice finding the wrong person, vindicating Rachel and biting the horse, instead of vindicating Bilhah or condemning Jacob for his sins against marriage or biting the rider who put himself and the horse on that snaky path in the first place. But that's a big maybe, because Dan, the man and the tribe, never amounted to anything. But eventually this messy family would produce a son whom everyone in the world can claim as our own, our vindication, the proof that God hears our pleas, hears even the plea for forgiveness that we can't stop sinning long enough to vocalize. And that son is a perfectly certain source of justice because the snake bit his heel, and he was nailed to a cross and died to save us. And from a certain perspective, in Jesus, justice found the wrong person, vindicating us, condemning him. And yet from our perspective, that couldn't be more right, because we get saved. And from God's perspective, it was exactly his will. The plan he set in motion long before Jacob and his sons and their 4 moms, long before Dan reminded Rachel of God's justice, probably in the wrong way, but it led her to think the right thing about God. So it worked out. Human justice is messy, and from a human perspective, so is God's. But God always gets it right. He gives rightness. He gives righteousness. He gives justice to us in Jesus. Dan grew up in a household that got very little right. But they understood this. God gets it right. And if Dan did nothing but believe that for his entire life and never amounted to anything more than a person who died believing that, well then God got his life right too. You and I are dust and breath, loved by God, bought by Jesus. This podcast is written and produced by me, Ethan Cherney, a WELS pastor serving Our Savior Lutheran Church in Pomona, California. Get in touch on Facebook at Dust and Breath Pod, on Twitter at Dust Breath Pod, or by emailing dustandbreathpod@gmail.com. Outro music is arranged and performed by Mr. Peter Shawy, who is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season and whose leaf does not wither. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you could leave a review in iTunes or just share an episode on social media, I'd really appreciate it. It's the only way other people can find the show. Now, go do what God made you to do. Be who God called you to be. Go see what God can do with dust and breath and faith in Jesus, his Son.